Okay, hi everyone. Hi, I'm Russ. This is Thomas.
Hello.
You might know me from Taylor 4 Gamers with Arbiter Ian. Thomas here is from Arbiter Ian's Discord. Hello, Thomas.
Hello there.
Basically, I decided I wanted to do some Horus Heresy videos. I've done some Legions Imperialis and some Old World ones, but the game that I always keep coming back to that maintains my interest is Horus Heresy. So I've decided to do some tactics videos, and I'm inviting a few friends that I've made from Arbiter Ian's Discord channel to join me in that. Largely because I really enjoy listening and watching Horus Heresy content myself, and I wanted to make some. And what I'm hoping to do is talk about the actual how to use things rather than a comparison of what's good and bad. But I felt that would be better as a conversation. So Thomas is here with me, also known as Macariel. Would you like to introduce
Sure.
yourself?
So I'm also playing Horus Heresy. It's my main Games Workshop game, I would say, because I tried, for example, 40k. I used to play 40k many years ago. Also tried a bit of fantasy here and there, but somehow I always find myself more motivated playing Heresy. Just recently tried to get back into 40k, but somehow bounced off of it. And I just enjoy the flexibility that Heresy gives much more than the constant chasing of the meta that you have in 40k. As you said, I've been attending various also Arbiter Ian organized events, but also some other events with my White Scars army. And I'm always happy to talk about units that are underappreciated, perhaps, and need some talking about.
And I think that's a big part of what I decided I'd like to do. Yeah, I think one of the units I want to talk about, and which we're going to talk about this time, is Scouts. And I think they've got quite a poor reputation, largely by comparison to Recon Marines is obviously their biggest comparison. And I'm not entirely convinced they deserve to be as overlooked as they are. I don't think they're an amazing unit, but I think there's some good points that people sometimes forget about, and I think there's some ways to use them to make them really valuable. So if we just talk through some of the pros and cons first, and then we can try and think about how to take advantage of those things.
Yeah, I mean, you already mentioned Recon Marines, right? And this is because
Yeah.
sometimes I like the idea of scouts, right? And I sometimes want to introduce them to my lists, but I always find myself using Recon Marines instead because they're not that much more expensive, but they're still a little bit more expensive. But the biggest issue I often have with the scouts is just their 4-up armor save, because there's a surprising number of weapons that have an armor piercing value of 4. And with Recon Marines, they're just a bit more survivable. So this is, for me, often a kind of a bit of an issue.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a major point. And yeah, it's one of the things I focused on when I was first thinking about this, is that the scouts have that -1 to their armor value. And like you said, lots of weapons. For example, heavy bolters, suddenly they're not going to get an armor save. And auto cannons. And I think especially now we see a lot more Thalax and a lot more Solar Auxilia running around. I think those weapons have become a lot more popular. I still think they get a save against a lot of small arms fire, but that's definitely a big problem. So I thought that sort of directly compensates for that as a stat, was they lose that point of armor, but they gain another point of movement. You're playing White Scars anyway, though. So
yes,
do you find that if you do use scouts, you even really notice that movement, or are you so fast anyway, it doesn't really matter?
well, it still makes a difference because, I mean, you say one movement is just a part of it, because the other issue, of course, they have moved to cover. So they can actually go through certain weapons effects, for example, also force you to go through difficult terrain. And so you can get sometimes an extra 2 inches you wouldn't have with a Recon Marine that you get with a Scout. So that all of these kind of add up. So it might be, if you use them like myself, I mean, I always have a Recon Marine squad, which is basically just there to deliver melter bombs on tanks. A Scout could do the same thing quite effectively, right? Because they could go really fast, really far, and so be also a bit more of a threat than their points cost would normally justify. So I think they could be quite useful, just distracting people as well.
I think that's a good point. I think actually coming away from the White Scars and then returning to your point, I think for most armies, the +1 movement is what tips them into getting +1 on the charge as well. So whereas for the White Scars, you're gaining that inch of movement, but it's not affecting your charge roll. For most people, it is they might get the 2 inches from them moving through cover. They might then get another movement of an inch of movement, and then another inch on the charge. So for some armies, it can make a big difference. And actually, one of the other things was that a squad of five scouts is 20 points cheaper than a squad of recon marines, and so that's paying for 5 melter bombs almost. You're only another 5 points, and then you're already at the same cost. So that feels like a fairly important one to me. Do you find that you manage to achieve much trying to use them for hunting after contemptors and Spartans and things like that, or is it more of a distraction to force your opponent to pay attention to you?
I find that as soon as I place, because I always make it very clear what to have smelter bombs, right? And I find that as soon as I put a unit with melter bombs at a certain range, they also they're a bit more careful where they place things. Of course, you can also use that advantage. And the other thing I noticed that if somebody having, for example, the augury scanner, that they force you to step further away, that kind of also affects a little bit of how they place their units in order to try to keep your scouts out of easy charging range. But the problem is, of course, if you don't have the first turn and they then manage to just shoot them down with autocannons. That said, I mean, one thing that we must not forget is, yes, they have a worse armor value, but they also get a plus 1 for the armor save they have. So if you have them in decent cover, you actually get quite a good cover save, so that can make them last a little bit longer.
It's the skirmish rule that gives them the +1 armor, +1 cover save, isn't it?
+1 cover save.
And you can hope a lot of the time, if they're actually in ruins rather than just in woods or something fairly light, you can still get that 4+ save, even though technically they haven't got their own save, but they can get themselves a save in that way. Yeah, so whilst that's definitely true, they'll get that against all weapons as well. And you can sort of hope that your opponent might start firing las cannons at them and waste shots on them as well.
Yes. Well, the other thing is, of course, is if they fire at your really cheap scout unit, they don't fire on anything else. So it can also work to advantage if they just kill some cheap scouts, because they could use those units to fire on something that's more valuable to you as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really important things, that if they're meant to be mainly there as a distraction, then you can actually sort of leverage that quite well in order to not waste points. I had a similar thing that I did for the first time the other day. I went to the Solar War event at the Heresy Hammer event down near Guildford, and I took for the first ever time some tarantulas. And I was absolutely convinced that the tarantulas were going to get absolutely wiped off the table immediately every turn because they were just an easy target. And I found that people didn't do that; they just ignored them instead. Whereas I think if you got a group of scouts running around, and even if it's 5 of them with melter bombs, people can't just ignore your scouts. So it's it's not a cheap option, but it is an option to force them to deal with them for 65 points for the scouts themselves, plus 25 for the melter bombs. It's 90 points, but they're completely impossible to ignore whilst other things move up the board. There's another thing though that is another point of difference is a lot of people, apart from the armor value, I think prefer recon marines because they've got line, which obviously is a huge part of the game. And one of the things that I really stopped to think about, I think one of the risks if a unit has got line and you're actually counting it and you're trying to count up how many units of line you've got in your army, you can actually land up working against yourself because, I've got to put them where they can score. And maybe you can put scouts without line where you don't need to think about that, and they can actually have a better line of sight if you've equipped them with Nemesis bolters, for example.
Oh yeah, I've been actually thinking about the same because in one of my last games, I've been having my recon marines with Nemesis bolters, and then they were a line unit in a nice distance to objective, right? So then I ran them across and they get shot at horribly. But of course, if they were not line, you can just let them sit somewhere really nicely remotely and just be a nuisance to your enemy. I think there's something to be said that it's a unit you don't. So if you use them as snipers, it's a unit you don't have to worry too much about and just can potentially snipe out a sergeant or an apothecary somewhere.
Yeah. And I think there's another note. I've never really thought about this, but when I was thinking about this video, I sat down and really carefully thought about the light rule as well, which recon marines don't have. So scouts can actually snap shoot after running, and it doesn't rule out heavy weapons for that. So one thing you could weirdly do with scout snipers that you can't do with recon snipers is you can run them and then still take snapshots, which isn't like going to be something you want to rely on, but it's like you might have that option where they're light, so they get +1 for their run, so they can move 8, then they can run 5, and then they can still snap shoot after having run. So, or they can run up the board in the first place, and then on the next turn they can charge. So I think there's that benefit of being a lot more maneuverable, like we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, the only difficulty with that is, of course, when they run, they can't get the benefit of cover. So then, of course, the 4 armor save is really working against them there. So because I've also been thinking about that, but that is an interesting one that for certain legions, for example, White Scars, right? We have this once a game movement shenanigan where you can basically have a free redeploy in a sense if somebody makes the mistake of getting close to you, and you can do just a normal move. And so if you get them you can kind of in some cases move them in your own in their own movement phase. So there is certain things you can play around there as well, where you could just get scouts in a interesting situation, and then your next turn move them again and run them, so they can actually get quite a far distance you wouldn't expect them to be. So, and people suddenly threatening the rear part of the line of your opponent. So that's a lot of things you can play around.
I was thinking about another thing, and I don't know if you do this or not. When you are equipping your scouts, especially the scouts that you're going to give melter bombs to run around after vehicles and maybe dreadnoughts, what do you give them? Do you give them extra hand weapons or shotguns or what?
Just usually give them the hand weapons, so if they get into a melee, that they get 2 attacks, or like the extra attack, because that can sometimes make a difference of, you're cutting somebody down with a chainsaw or not. Because shotguns, I found, if I give them melter bombs, I don't really shoot, because normally you have to shoot at the same target you charge, right? And I have not yet seen a tank that you can hurt with a shotgun.
If you shoot at the back of a rhino, you can glance, I believe.
Yeah, if you're really lucky, yeah.
Yeah, if you're really lucky, you can glance a rhino. I think the reason I even thought about it, and I've not really tried this myself because it's a low chance of this. It's another way of making the enemy slightly more scared of you, though, is that if you have your unit there and there's no vehicles, you might want to send them after a dreadnought. And the thing is, I know it's only a 1 in 6 chance, but this part of me is just really tempted by that 1 in 6 chance that you have of concussing the dreadnought and bringing it back down to weapon skill 4. It just feels like that there's that only tiny little chance, but even that just gives you that edge maybe again against that sort of target. And then I thought even further that perhaps, well, if you shoot the dreadnought and then you don't manage to concuss it, well, maybe just don't charge, because the dreadnought might not want to ignore you and might charge you, and then you might get to try and concuss it again a second time. If there's enough concussion in your army and enough blind in your army, then at some point it's going to start annoying your enemy enough that it's going to make them think about it enough to maybe make them make a mistake.
Yeah, maybe, but I mean, I'm just thinking, if I'm feeling a dreadnought, I would not be too concerned about a bunch of scouts or shotguns, really. I probably would have other bigger fish to fry with my dreadnought. I mean, playing White Scars, typically I don't have that many dreadnoughts. I don't use that many dreadnoughts, and mine are usually up there to charge towards the enemy, front towards the enemy, and try to claw them to death, stuff like this. So, I mean, I would invite anybody to try to come with a couple of scars with shotguns, but I probably just ignore them and charge at something bigger. But yeah, maybe if you kind of, I mean, we talk about movement, right? If you manage to get them really far across the field and attack some of the more shooty dreadnoughts, then you can not only shoot at them, but also, I mean, not every dreadnought has close combat weapons, right?
That's
if you
true.
have a shooty dreadnought, they don't have armor piercing up the wazoo, so you can actually tie them down, because by the time it might take them a couple of turns to stomp down your scouts, and if they have, let's say, a melter bomb with them, they might actually be able to take down dreadnought.
That's a good point. And I think actually, when you say that as well, one thing I haven't really thought about is the fact that if you're out flanking, then you might even not even have to run that far to reach shooty dreadnought standing at the back. I mean, your opponent obviously can respond to that by how they position their army, but once again, then just the very fact that they're having to rethink what they're doing based on you moving some irritating little scouts in their way is probably a good thing as well, isn't it? Most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, I had definitely games where I managed to frustrate a dreadnought by having them surrounded by cheap troops, and they were just trying to stomp at them one turn at a time. I mean, chances are is a unit without melter bombs not going to frame him down, but they can stop him from shooting, right? And that is often
that's a really
what
good
you
point.
really want to avoid.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, and maybe that's something I want to try some more, because I've got a lot of scouts with my Raven Guard, and maybe that's a way of not even going after the dreadnoughts with the close combat weapon. Go after the dreadnought with the pair of Volkites, or the pair of conversion beamers, or the pair of las cannons. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think one of the things, apart from the general stuff, unless you've got anything else to say, I wanted to think about specific legions, or have you got anything to add just in general about scouts?
No, I think we covered the most points, really. I mean, they're mostly competing in a sense in your list with mostly recon marines, and I think we got to a few advantages that scouts potentially have, especially if you're preparing a list for an event where you have a certain points limit and there's just a few points in it. Then perhaps take, instead of a scout, both for snipers or for melter bomb delivery services, and they might just be fitting in where recon marines might just be a little bit too expensive.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. But you also mentioned then, sort of said they'll generally be compared against recon squads. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was thinking about World Eaters, to now start thinking about specific legion, they sort of compare in a way there to despoiler squads. I mean, the downside is they'll only ever have a maximum of 10 in a squad instead of 20. But one of the things that did occur to me is with World Eaters, if you're trying to get across the board, then unless you're spending quite a lot of points on transports, if you've got big despoiler squads trying to leg it across the board, they're going to get shot up. But if there were a couple of scout squads nearby already, your opponent would pretty much have to focus on the thing that's closest for the charge rather than the thing that's further away. So a couple of scout squads might help larger World Eater squads make it across the table if you were playing that sort of list. And they'd be more likely to succeed with their charge. And obviously, as a World Eater, the last thing you want is to fail a charge and stand around in the open to be shot at. That way they're more likely to get their charge bonuses and all that sort of thing for a close combat legion. So that was one of the legions that I would think, if I was going to run World Eaters, I definitely want some scouts geared up for close combat. Yeah, just to distract from the rest of my army as they run across the table.
Yeah, I still haven't finished my White Scars army. It's ever expanding. But no, yeah, I mean, we already mentioned the +1 movement speed and this movement shenanigans. And of course, for White Scars, the movement is very important. I mean, it's the most important aspect of that army. Having like cheap units you can also use. I mean, you talk about making sure that they get a charge, but of course you can use scouts also for kind of screening units, like they often also used in typical 40k games, where you just put them in front of a more important unit. So if somebody charges at you, they have to go through a scouts first, which is then your cheap screen to prevent a charge or an easy charge towards you.
Which is something you tend to see more from solar auxiliary players. But actually, scouts, I think, can be cheap enough to even do that within a legion's list. And you're not going to want to throw your scouts away deliberately, but I think they're cheap enough they can be given that role and have them flexible. If they're not doing other jobs, they can do that for you instead.
Yes, you can also use a scout as a counter scout. So, for example, if you see the opponent has their scouts or recurrent marines with melter bombs, you just put your scouts in front of your tank, and then they have to get through your scouts.
Yeah, I wrote one list where 5 scouts were just meant to ride around in the back of a Land Raider Explorator, just in case someone tried to outflank and blow my Land Raider Explorator up with melter bombs. There's a few other lists I think can be really good as well. I'll save what I think might be the best one for last. I run a Blood Angels list at the moment, and I've been mainly using Day of Revelation. But I think another interesting one, Blood Angels obviously get +1 to wound on the charge, and you get that whether it's a so-called sort of successful charge or not. And I just think because Blood Angel Scouts have got that +1 to their charge, compared to other Blood Angels infantry, they're slightly more likely to get there. And it'll also mean their melter bombs will actually wound Contemptors on a 2+, which is a nice little bonus. Or they could even attack with like other weapons, and they could potentially wound Contemptors with chainswords on a rerollable 5+. And it's not something you're going to want to do as an initial plan A, but it might be a decent plan B for them.
It's going to be your plan of last resort, your plan Omega. So the last thing you can think of.
Yeah. But it's that nice little extra that makes them slightly better than they might otherwise be thought of in a Blood Angels list. Another one where it's a bit similar was Iron Hands, and this is a little bit marginal, but that -1 strength to shooting attacks as they're running around, normally that would be followed up by a 3+ armor save. But if you never even need to use your armor save because they fail to wound you in the first place, then you don't need a 4+ or a 3+ save. You don't need a saving throw at all. So I do feel that weirdly, Iron Hands, who you'd never really think about as being a scout using Legion, actually therefore mitigates that huge disadvantage of having a crap armor save, because they don't need it, because they've got the -1 strength against them instead in the first place.
Well, of course, there's certain weapons. I mean, we already mentioned the autocannon's gonna be a pain for every scout. They're not gonna do too much about them, but for example, heavy bolters already, they're much less likely to wound as well. And so that might save the scouts a little bit, at least get them across the field so that they can do whatever they were supposed to do.
Just carry on being a nuisance for a little bit longer. Yes. There was 2 more, and I can't decide which one of these I like the best, but one of the ones I thought about for a chapter that's already, I think, widely considered to be one of the 2 or 3 strongest legions was Night Lords, because it just means they're already nice and close for making use of fear. Because obviously fear is only going to work once someone's within 12 inches. And if you're using, and I think most, not all, but most Night Lords lists tend to use Deep Strike Assault lists. But Scouts is another way of putting fear on someone from very early in the game if you're trying to pin them, for example, that you might not otherwise be able to manage. So it's just a nice little extra thing they can do, even if they don't actually achieve much else.
Oh yeah, because you can get them really close to your opponent, really, pretty much already with deployment, right? And so that might also again force the other side to rethink a little bit of how they place their units. And I mean, that's also what you want, right? You have the person you're playing with second guess everything they're doing, ideally, so that they make a mistake and you can just walk through.
Well, especially if you're trying to put them near a generally pretty good unit or a good shooting unit, perhaps, and a combination of fear and shell shock, rotor cannons.
Rotor cannon, yes.
Just that slight increased chance. Yeah, you get that slightly increased chance of pinning them. It just, that could really make a big difference in some games as well.
And the Night Lords have this rule that if they are more in the unit than the enemy they're shooting at, for example, so they also would benefit from larger squads rather than just having the minimum amount running around.
Well, the other thing then as well is that if the scouts help the terror squad pin the squad the scouts are near, then the scouts then, if they were to charge, even without outnumbering that squad, gain, I think, the same bonus. So they help pin the person, which then gives them their own bonus. And I think like Night Lords could, if you get it right, and I think it's one of those things that you'd have to be pretty good at what you're doing. And once people do it to you once or twice, it'd be harder to catch them out. But again, it's just options. But yeah, my number one Legion for using scouts is probably Emperor's Children. I think a combination of the fact that they're going to make their attacks at +1 initiative when they make a successful charge. So they're going to be more likely to succeed on the charge. So they're more likely to get their +1 initiative. So they're probably going to kill some opponents before they strike back. So they're, again, going to be less worried about their crap saving throw. So it just seems like Emperor's Children can sort of stack up a lot of benefits from this +1 movement compared to, say, Recon Marines. Or even trying to get a despoiler squad across the board, let's say. And just the sort of benefits cycle back on themselves and sort of add up, that I think a couple of Emperor's Children scout squads could really do a surprising amount of damage and last a surprisingly long time, just because, and I found this with my Blood Angels using Power Lances, send in an assault squad with Power Lances, they're not going to kill loads and loads of people, but they're going to kill enough that they take fewer wounds back in return. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that idea, and if I kind of want to do Emperor's Children almost just for that reason, you know.
Don't forget, the important thing is, if you're in close combat with another unit, you don't have to kill all of them. You just have to kill more than they kill of you, so that you win the combat. Maybe you force them to build a leadership, and then you can run them over.
Yeah, and if you can do that with a relatively cheap scout squad on a relatively buffed up tactical squad, you can have a surprisingly big influence on them.
You disappeared.
And I think I just thought of one thing that I didn't even put in my document here, actually, as a general comment, is that generally I wouldn't have thought about putting apothecaries into a scout squad, because they're only 8-point models, and so who cares about scouts enough to bother putting an apothecary there? But actually, whilst apothecaries, you don't want to really necessarily use them to save low point cost models, they're going to get to use their ability more than other Marines. Because if you've got an autocannon shooting at tactical Marines, the tactical Marines are normally going to be saving on a 3+ and not need their apothecary. Whereas a unit of scouts with an apothecary in it, they're going to be getting that 5+ feel no pain every single time an autocannon or a heavy bolter shoots at them. So suddenly I'm thinking, maybe even though scouts are cheap, maybe that is something to consider. Because when you put apothecary in with a squad like that, they pick up the same benefits and gain. No, because they'd lose it's the slowest model in the unit that determines your charge bonus, isn't it? An apothecary will pick up most of the same special rules as a unit you put it in. So if you were to put it in a unit where you spent quite a lot of money on Nemesis bolters, it might not be points badly spent, because actually a scout squad with Nemesis bolters would probably get more benefit than a recon squad with Nemesis bolters, because it'd resort to the apothecary more often. So I wonder if there's like a good case. By the time you spent 18 points on each Nemesis bolter scout, it's going to make up for a lot of the problems that they have.
There's also, again, a lot of specialized armies. For example, again, White Scouts have the Sagyamazan, where they can get a 5-up feel no pain for all infantry, where you can have then very tough scouts in that sense, because that accounts for all infantry units. So they could then have scouts with a 5-up feel no pain. If they might not have an armor save, but they might still be able to stick around a little bit longer. And because you mentioned close combat, and might not hurt that much to have a bad armor save. If you look at a lot of armor piercing values for close combat weapons, they quite often have either 3 or 5. There's not that many melee weapons that have an armor piercing of 4. So actually, in close combat, often if something hits you that ignores your 4-up armor save, it probably would also ignore your 3-up.
Overall, I think there are probably more benefits to a recon squad still, but I do think that there are situations where the scout might actually be better. And I was thinking about this, and I had a conversation about this with Gary as well, and this conversation was quite a while ago now. And one thing that he suggested, because he does use scouts in his Space Wolf army, and he uses them as Nemesis bolter scouts. But one thing that he was going to try, and this sounded like a really good idea to me, instead of taking a squad of 5 recon Marines with Nemesis bolters, take a squad of 5 scouts with Nemesis bolters and use all of the points that you save to buy extra scouts without Nemesis bolters and just use them as ablative wounds. So they'll have a slightly different footprint, but obviously you just try and position the snipers so they've got the best possible view, and then put the rest of them where you can still justify using them as casualties. And you can get almost the same amount of shooting for the scouts as you would the recon Marines. And the first 5 wounds don't count for anything. And they're literally just not degrading the sort of shooting effectiveness of the unit at all. Because sometimes having 10 scouts shoot at a unit might almost be overkill, whereas 5 might be just the right number. So that was something I thought might be a fun one to try as well, and see if that sort of frustrates people.
Yeah, you might, however, find yourself on the receiving end of really nasty template weapons and stuff like Scorpius missile launchers.
Yeah, that is a good point. It's funny actually, considering how good Scorpiuses are. You don't see quite as many as you might actually expect, though. I find there's a lot. There's a few of them around.
Maybe because they're too good. No, I think it's because there's just so many other good units that kind of compete with the heavy support
Yeah.
slot. But yeah, it's considering how effective they can be. I'm also surprised that I don't see them that much on the table. I think I've encountered a Scorpius missile launcher once on the other side in the last year. I don't know why not more people are using them.
Yeah, I've only come across them 2 or 3 times myself, actually. I think people sort of worry that they'll be looked down upon for that sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. I just thought of another problem with Scout Swords, though, and I've just checked it, and I'm right. And this is a bad one. Scouts can't take augury scanners, which, if you've loaded them up with Nemesis bolters, is actually something I consider quite a big problem. That if you want to have a sniper squad, one of the biggest things that I would want to do would be to put an augury scanner on them, which now makes me think again. I start to wonder if scouts are not that great in the sniper role, and maybe the best way to use them is as the sort of the harassers, if you will. Yeah, so I think overall, would you think there is a place for scouts, or would you think it's pretty much fall down on the side of probably recon marines or maybe despoilers, depending on what you're doing?
I would think that a lot of people would still prefer to use either recon marines or, for example, also the seeker squads, especially when you talk about scouting. Sniper roles. However, I mean, now that we talked through it a little bit, I do now ponder a little bit of using them just as cheap harassing units to just try to get in the back of the line and try to perhaps blow up some dreadnought that is a shooty dreadnought, things like this.
Yeah.
But of course, these would be quite situational uses, but just the ability to move through cover and that you can actually get them quite far and this can still shoot and cause mayhem might be just enough to distract the opponent enough that you can do something else that is more valuable. So I think they have a space on the table, but I think they will be very situational.
Yeah. I think I probably agree with you, but I think something about the challenge of trying to find a way to make them work really just grabs me. I think if we've got a little bit of time left, if you don't mind, can we just talk about Pathfinders very quickly? The Pathfinder console choice.
Yeah, I mean, before you mentioned them, before we started recording, I had completely forgotten they exist. That's how often I'm using them.
I've literally never seen one on the table. And I think it's largely because they're pretty shit. And I think they're almost completely irredeemable in any list whatsoever. I can't really, if I'm honest, have the same thoughts I had for the scouts. Even coming up with the situational things for scouts. I did note that one thing that they kind of do is they have a speed of 8 like the scouts, but the thing they don't have is light. So I was thinking, well, Pathfinders, if they had light, you could almost justify putting them in a scout squad to try and toughen up your scout squad and give them a few cool options. But as it is without that, it just seems utterly pointless. They do get skirmish. They will get the +1 to charge, but they're going to be robbing the scouts of the light. It just seems like an obvious thing that was just missed because maybe no one, when they were doing the rules, even noticed that and didn't stop and think about it. The only thing I could come up with for Pathfinders was perhaps 1,000 Suns army could buy the Psyker upgrade for a Pathfinder, because then you could have a Pathfinder who can infiltrate and then scout and already be like that close to the enemy for the purpose of starting to throw some psychic stuff around from close range. But overall, I think if we can say that scouts are situational, can we just agree that Pathfinders are shit and they should have some extra rules
absolutely.
to make them better?
I think we fully agree on that one. As I said,
the only thing I thought of that for the same points they cost now, which is only a plus 15 points upgrade, I would think that if they're part of a flanking assault, then I think they should be able to let them and the other things with them in their flanking assault re-roll their reserve rolls to see if they arrive. And I think that alone would give them a roll in a list for 15 points. And they'd still be marginal, but it would be enough
pretty shit regardless. But at least they could have, would have some benefit from using them.
Yeah. Or allow a squad of scouts that they join to gain line. But overall, I think, I look at Pathfinders and I want to see a way to make them work. And I've looked at them multiple times and been, there's no reason to ever take a Pathfinder that I can think of unless you're Thousand Suns and have a cunning plan involving close range psychics from turn 1. And even that, I can't see it.
You know what? I'm looking forward to the very first comment who calls us fools for ignoring the Pathfinders of the stream.
I hope so, because I genuinely love to be able to use a Pathfinder in a useful way. Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Thomas. I think let's call it an evening there.
Yeah,
and I don't pretend to be amazing at this game of Horus Heresy, but I do like thinking about it, and I like to sort of generate discussion. So hopefully, some people will have some thoughts on what we've said. People might have found that some of the stuff we suggested, they've tried it doesn't work. They might have found other things that we've missed or confirmed that some ideas could work. And some of these things I've done myself anyway. But thanks for your time. Bye now.
Bye-bye.